Welcome, Nocturnal Minds, aboard. Your learning journey starts now. So, we've just explored the conscious, cognitive level of our minds. Now, let's see how easily that gets taxed. Think about it. When you're pressed for time, exhausted, or even a bit tipsy, do you suddenly become more cautious, more traditional? The evidence suggests yes. It's easier to nudge a liberal towards conservative thinking under cognitive load than the other way around. Why? Because the default, more flexible mode requires less mental effort. This isn't just theory. Look at judicial decisions. Parole rates plummet right before judges hit their lunch break, hitting near 0%, then jump back up to 60% after they've eaten. Justice, it seems, has a very literal stomach for the matter. Okay, so where does this ideological divide actually come from? Jonathan Haidt offers a fascinating framework, moral foundations theory. He posits 6 fundamental pillars of morality that everyone uses, but to different degrees. Think care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, liberty versus oppression. These are pretty universal. But then there's loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation. Here the split often emerges. Liberals tend to lean heavily on the first 3, valuing individual rights and fairness above all. Conservatives, however, value all 6 foundations, often placing significant weight on the latter 3, loyalty to the group, respect for authority, and maintaining sacred traditions or purity. This creates stark differences in judgment. Is criticizing your own group disloyal? Should laws ever be disobeyed? Is burning a flag an act of disrespecting a symbol? The answers diverge sharply based on which moral foundations are prioritized. Is one side morally impoverished by using fewer foundations, or is the other side more refined by focusing on certain ones? That's the debate. Beyond moral reasoning, there are deep-seated differences in how left and right-leaning individuals generally feel about the world. On average, conservatives tend to dislike ambiguity; they prefer clear-cut situations. They often have a stronger need for closure, meaning they want definitive answers quickly. Novelty can be unsettling for them, and they often find comfort in established structures and hierarchies. Consequently, they might be quicker to perceive threats in ambiguous situations. Their empathy can also be more parochial, extending less readily to those outside their immediate circle. Liberals, conversely, tend to be more comfortable with ambiguity and novelty. They often have a weaker need for closure and feel less constrained by rigid structures. They might be less prone to seeing immediate threats and exhibit broader empathy, extending it to wider groups of people. These aren't absolute rules, but consistent patterns emerge across studies. So what does this emotional wiring mean in practice? Well, the dislike of ambiguity and preference for the familiar helps explain why conservatives often look to the past for solutions. Make America great again, while liberals tend to embrace reform and envision a novel future. The need for structure and predictability fuels support for strong authority in law and order. It also sheds light on puzzling political phenomena, like why some economically disadvantaged groups might vote against their immediate interests. It's not necessarily irrational calculation. It can be a form of system justification, preferring the devil you know over the uncertain alternative, driven by a deep-seated need for stability. The heightened threat perception, especially when linked to authoritarianism, means conservatives might be more easily alarmed by perceived dangers, reacting faster to words like snake or mugger, experiencing more nightmares, and perhaps being more susceptible to fear-based messaging. Interestingly, despite these potential psychological burdens, research sometimes finds conservatives reporting higher happiness. Maybe it's the relief of having simpler narratives, the comfort of justifying the existing system, or feeling less disturbed by inequality because it's seen as natural or deserved. Let's dive deeper into the biological underpinnings. Remember the insular cortex, the brain region involved in processing disgust, both literal like bad food and metaphorical like moral revulsion. There's a striking link here. Studies show that simply exposing people to unpleasant smells like garbage can make them more socially conservative. It seems our visceral reaction to something dirty can translate into a judgment about something socially different being wrong. This connects to the finding that conservatives generally have lower thresholds for disgust. They react more strongly physiologically, like increased skin conductance, to negative social images compared to liberals. When faced with something gross, they're less likely to employ reappraisal strategies, like telling themselves it's fake, but they are more likely to suppress their feelings. Interestingly, if you tell conservatives to try to be detached, their political views can shift towards liberalism. This suggests political orientation on social issues is deeply tied to sensitivity to disgust and how we manage those feelings. Some argue, like Leon Kass did with his infamous ice cream licking example, that disgust itself is a form of wisdom, a gut feeling that tells us what's right. But the obvious flaw is that disgust is subjective and changes over time. What was once deeply offensive becomes acceptable later. The story doesn't stop with the insula. Other brain regions also show correlations. Research using structural MRI has found that liberalism is associated with larger gray matter volume in the cingulate cortex, a region heavily involved in empathy and processing social information. Conversely, conservatism is linked to a larger amygdala, the brain's central alarm system for detecting threats. Functionally, this aligns with the findings. Conservatives show greater amygdala activation when viewing disgusting images or engaging in risky tasks. However, the picture isn't always neat. When looking at disgust responses, conservatives also activate a whole bunch of other areas: basal ganglia, thalamus, parts of the frontal cortex, temporal lobes. It's a complex network. How exactly all these regions interact to produce the conservative response to social issues is still a work in progress, but it clearly points to differences in threat detection and emotional processing. Could genetics play a role? Twin studies suggest that about half of the variation in political orientation within a population is due to genetic factors, a heritability estimate around 50%. Genome-wide association studies have tried to pinpoint specific genes. They've identified some variants linked to political views, but many of these genes have unknown functions or weren't initially thought to be brain-related. Even among the few with known brain functions, like one involved in glutamate signaling, the connection to political ideology isn't immediately illuminating. Things get more interesting with gene-environment interactions. For instance, a version of the dopamine receptor gene often linked to novelty-seeking and risk-taking is associated with liberalism, but only in people who have lots of friends. It seems social context moderates the genetic effect. However, we need to be cautious. Many of these genetic findings haven't been replicated reliably. The effects are often small, and they're frequently published in political science rather than top genetics journals. It's likely that any genetic influence works indirectly, perhaps by shaping traits like anxiety levels, which then influence political leanings. Now, let's shift gears to another powerful force shaping human behavior: obedience and conformity. Unlike a low-ranking baboon giving way to the alpha male, human obedience often involves submitting to abstract concepts of authority, not just a specific person. It ranges from simple compliance, doing what you're told publicly, without necessarily agreeing, to full-blown internalization, like the tragic events at Jonestown. Conformity is closely related, going along with the group. Both involve yielding to external pressures, but they can lead to vastly different outcomes. Conforming can be beneficial, like agreeing on basic social norms, or dreadful, like joining a mob. Obedience can be mundane, like stopping at a red light, or horrific, like following orders in a death camp. Understanding these forces is crucial, as they operate constantly in our lives. Where do these tendencies come from? Not surprisingly, they have deep evolutionary roots. We see conformity in other animals. Primates learn social rules by observing others, not just through direct punishment. A subordinate doesn't need to be beaten up repeatedly to know how to behave towards a dominant. Watching others do it is enough. Chimpanzees, for instance, are more likely to copy an action if they see three different chimps do it once each, rather than one chimp doing it 3 times. This mirrors human behavior even in toddlers. Social contagion is rampant. Aggression spreads between groups. Yawning is contagious. There's even a famous study where male grouse, initially ignored by females, suddenly became desirable when surrounded by fake female admirers. Frans de Waal's work with chimps is particularly telling. Two groups watched different alpha females solve a puzzle box. Later, when given the box, the chimps copied their respective alphas' method, even if they accidentally discovered a better way themselves. They abandoned the better method just because it wasn't the norm. This happens in monkeys too, leading them to avoid perfectly good food simply because the group avoids dyed maize. And it happens incredibly fast in humans. Research shows our brains can detect group disagreement and start processing a potential change in opinion in under half a second. What's happening inside our heads when we conform? Several brain systems are involved. Social identity theory suggests we conform partly because belonging feels good. Imitating others activates our reward system, dopamine release. Making a mistake feels worse if you did it alone versus as part of a group. But there's also the negative side. Discovering you're wrong triggers anxiety circuits, the amygdala and insula light up. This feeling of difference equals wrongness activates a reinforcement learning network involving the VMPFC, ACC, and nucleus accumbens. This circuit essentially teaches us that being different from the group means being wrong. Crucially, studies using transcranial magnetic stimulation temporarily disabling the VMPFC showed people were less likely to conform, confirming its role. Sometimes, conformity involves genuine memory revision, linked to hippocampal activity, making you literally remember things differently to fit the group narrative. In extreme cases, even our sensory processing centers, like the occipital cortex responsible for vision, seem to get involved, trying to convince us we saw something different from reality. It's a complex interplay of reward, anxiety, learning, and even memory manipulation, all geared towards fitting in. These ideas about conformity and obedience took terrifying form in three landmark, controversial experiments. Solomon Asch demonstrated the power of conformity in the 1950s. Volunteers, thinking they were taking a simple perception test, were pitted against Confederates who unanimously gave incorrect answers. Astonishingly, about a third of the volunteers conformed, giving the wrong answer publicly, even though the correct answer was obvious. Then came Stanley Milgram's obedience studies in the early 1960s. Volunteers were assigned to be teachers and administer electric shocks to learners for incorrect answers, escalating the voltage. An authority figure, the scientist, insisted they continued despite the learners' screams of pain and pleas to stop. Despite hesitation and distress, about two-thirds of the teachers administered the maximum, potentially lethal shock. Finally, Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment in 1971. College students were randomly assigned to be prisoners or guards in a simulated prison. Guards were given power to maintain order. What happened? The guards quickly became abusive, cruel, and dehumanizing, while the prisoners became passive and depressed. The experiment had to be terminated after only 6 days due to the escalating brutality. What's the core takeaway from these disturbing studies? As Mazarin Banaji puts it, situations matter. These experiments, born from trying to understand how ordinary Germans could participate in the Holocaust or why soldiers committed atrocities in Vietnam, revealed that ordinary people, placed in specific circumstances with sufficient pressure, can be induced to do things they would normally never consider. Zimbardo famously argued for a bad barrel theory. It's not just that bad people exist, but that bad situations can corrupt anyone. He suggested that given the same situational forces, anyone could potentially become an abusive guard or a shocking teacher. Milgram himself made a chilling prediction about finding personnel for death camps in any American town. Alexander Solzhenitsyn captured this idea poignantly. The line between good and evil runs through every human heart. These studies remind us that context is everything. Of course, these studies haven't been without massive controversy. Ethical concerns were paramount. Many participants were deeply distressed afterward. Modern replications use less harmful methods, like virtual shocks or ordering participants to say insulting things. Scientific critiques also abound. Regarding Milgram, researcher Gina Perry analyzed his unpublished data and recordings, suggesting he might have manipulated results to make compliance seem higher than it was. Many attempts to replicate his findings were done for TV or film, not rigorous academic research. Perry also argues that more participants likely realized the learner was faking it than Milgram admitted. The SP faced even fiercer criticism. Was Zimbardo, serving as superintendent, biased? Did his excitement and authority pressure the guards beyond just peer pressure? Were the volunteers already different? A later study found that people responding to an ad for a prison study scored higher on aggression and authoritarianism than those responding to a similar ad without the word prison. And crucially, has the SP been independently replicated? The BBC prison study tried but yielded vastly different results. These controversies highlight the need for caution in interpreting such complex, ethically fraught research. The BBC prison study, conducted by Stephen Reicher and Alex Haslam in 2001, aimed to replicate the SPE, but the outcome was night and day different. Instead of guards becoming abusive, the prisoners organized themselves, resisted the guards effectively, and even established a cooperative commune where power was shared. Prisoner morale soared while guard morale tanked. This utopian phase was short-lived, however, collapsing when a small group of ex-prisoners with high authoritarian scores overthrew the leadership and reimposed a harsh regime. The BBC study strongly suggests that the SPE's brutal outcome might have been more due to the specific individuals involved, the bad apples, rather than the situation itself being inherently corrupting. Zimbardo, unsurprisingly, criticized the BBC study's methodology, but Reicher and Haslam pointed out historical precedents for prisoner uprisings, arguing that resistance is a fundamental aspect of power dynamics. Amidst all the debate, two things seem clear. First, yes, ordinary people can be pushed to do terrible things when pressured to conform or obey. Contemporary research confirms this, even showing different brain activation patterns when actions are performed voluntarily versus obediently. Second, and perhaps more importantly, there are always individuals who resist. Think of the Hutus who protected Tutsi neighbors, Germans who saved Jews from Nazis, or whistleblowers exposing abuse. Some apples simply don't rot, even in the worst barrels. So, what influences whether we succumb or resist? Several factors modulate these pressures. The nature of the authority or group matters. Legitimate, prestigious, stable authorities exert more pressure. Numbers matter too, though less so in real-world mobs than in labs. Context is key. Incremental steps make crossing lines seem rational, and diffusing responsibility through procedures like firing squads or anonymity makes compliance easier. The nature of the victim also plays a role. Abstract victims are easier to harm than individuated ones, though authorities often label victims negatively to increase compliance. Individual differences like personality traits, gender, and cultural background also play a part. Stress increases susceptibility, while the perception of alternatives and seeing others resist provides crucial support for defiance. So, wrapping up this section, humans are creatures deeply attuned to status, navigating complex hierarchies that extend far beyond other species, including abstract socioeconomic ones with uniquely corrosive effects. Our political leanings often reflect deep-seated cognitive and affective styles, sometimes prioritizing gut feelings over reasoned thought. Our powerful need to conform and obey, rooted in biology, can lead us down dark paths, yet resistance is always possible. Understanding these forces, both within ourselves and in the situations we find ourselves in, is vital for making better choices and resisting harmful pressures.